Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is Matthew Herman. I do technical support for Metavis platform. This broadcast does apply to Metavis and not to Content Matrix. So everything we're talking about here is from the perspective of Metavis. I am showing my presentation right now, so I'm going to get right to it. This is about me. I'm a support lead on the Metavis product. I do escalations, and I'm the point of contact for two Fortune 500 companies that we support. Okay, so first up is why do we need user mappings? What is the point? What do they do? A user mapping allows us to go from one environment to the other and show the program how to resolve users in the target. So basically, in your source, you're going to have one username, and in the target, it may be something completely different. This is a common scenario that occurs when you're going between environments. And if you don't have user mapping, many times it will not resolve. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what happens when we don't have a user mapping? Like what is the behavior that we are going to see? Basically, what will happen is we first move this object over from the source to the target, and the object is going to come over with the connection account on it, and the created and modified times the file was moved. This is because we want to make sure that these times and user accounts are valid, because you can get some weird behavior if you don't have core properties on items. So we want to make sure that's set correctly and get the data over there and moved successfully. Then the step two is to set these values, the core values, to the times and the users that they should have. Now, it's this part that you're going to run into a problem if you don't have a correctly configured user mapping file. Sometimes this behavior can cause, well, depending upon how number 3 pans out, you can get different behavior. So number 3 is if we didn't find the user in step number 2, we use a setting that you can set in your profile manager. It's called default user account. And this setting is going to apply that user to any cases where we can't find the user in the target. So if your user mapping is not set, but you do have a default mapping and that user resolves, then you may end up seeing that user on everyone. But depending upon how number 3 pans out, you're going to see different behavior. But the key thing to see here is when you look in the target and you don't see the correct user on a file when it's the connection account, first thing I think is user mapping. The second thing I would think of would be checkouts. But let's stick with user mapping for this purpose of this webinar. All right, so how do we make a user mapping file? A user mapping file contains pairs of 2 values separated by a comma. The leftmost value is always the source, and the rightmost value is always the target. So if you were to look in the example given here, to your source is going to be, MV M Herman. To the left of that slash is the domain, and the target is Metalogic /M Herman. So in order to map that, you would just put the value on the left, comma, the value on the right. Now, many times you're going to have hundreds or thousands of users. In that situation, you're going to want to wildcard those. And the wildcard will just say anything that you can replace anything in the wildcard, the exact string. So if you look at the example below that, you can see that we are replacing M Herman in both places, but we'd also replace any other username that was exactly the same. So you can run into instances where this wildcard does not apply. In the instance where, say, you have users that don't have the exact same name. Maybe you went from first initial to first name in your username, in which case you would need to do something else. You'd probably have to map them individually. So let's go to the next one here. Now, there's some other factors to take into consideration here. You have some environments are going to use claims. All right, so you have some forms of authentication strings here, and those are going to affect your user mapping. So let's look at the example here from 2013 to SharePoint Online. You can see here in the example that your username is going to be slightly different than it was before. You've got a string on the front of it, but in this case, you can still wildcard and you still have the same behavior that we saw earlier, the same ability to create a user mapping file. Now, one thing to know about user mapping files is that they apply from the top to the bottom. So let's say you had one of these wildcards here in there just as a catch-all. You could map specific users to other users, at the top of the file, and then have a catch-all at the bottom. All right. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. So how do you get the usernames to put into these files? So you can do this through SharePoint, but this is actually not as easy as some other methods to get them. In Metavis, you can right-click on your site and click Reports, and then select Site Users Report, and that's going to give you a CSV of the usernames that you can use to generate this mapping file. The second option is to tag an item and select a static value to put into that item. So if you try to tag modified by, you'll see permissible values to go into modified by, and you can use those as the basis to create this file. So this is what they would look like. If you look at on the left there, that is sort of a CSV that you would see coming out of a site users report. And on the right, that would be what you would see when you try to tag something with a static value. In both cases, you can see the value that you would want to map, and you would be able to take that out of the CSV, put that on the left or the right, as the case may be, wherever you've got those reports from, and then use that to generate your user mapping. Okay, so our final example here is, say, like going from 2010 into SPO. We already saw the 2013 into SPO earlier. How would we accomplish that? You can, I'm sorry, in the bottom of the slide here, I didn't put an asterisk. So you would replace M. Herman in there with an asterisk, and that would map multiple users, or specific users would be the example that you see there below. Lastly, where can you get more information? You can contact support, and we will be happy to go over any questions you have with this, but there is a detailed example in here, maybe not as detailed as this, under the URL at the manualmetavistech.com. Any other questions about user mapping, guys? I don't see any, so I will thank you guys for coming out. I will put this up on the site, and you guys can look at this later. Thank you. Bye.